So thanks everyone for joining me. Looks like we're rolling. I'll just launch straight into it because this is partly biographical as well. So the intellectual breadth and depth of Bruno Latour's career is, in the words of Actant-Rhizome, a bewildering cabinet of curiosities. Since the late 1970s, Latour has produced some 14 monographs and published around 120 articles, mainly in international peer-reviewed journals. He's published a series of anthologies, several interview books, including with Michel Callon and Francois Ewald, an avant-garde illustrated essay about the city of Paris with the photographer and author Émilie Himol. And the subjects of his monograph range from laboratory life in the Nobel Prize-winning Salk Institute in San Diego, the shared history of microbes, microbiologists and society in the pasteurization of France, the tragic fate of Aramis, an innovative public transport system, file handling and the passage of law at the French Supreme Court for Administrative Law, the Council of State, and geopolitics in the epoch of the Anthropocene, which is where I will conclude today's lecture. He's also written about religion and religious speech, economics, ethnopsychiatry, modernity, politics, and philosophy of science. So the question of where does one begin a lecture on such a thinker with such substantive and ongoing contributions to these diverse fields brings to mind the old puzzle of how one eats an elephant, one bite at a time, of course. So the first bite begins with my own experience with Latour, which began with a recommendation from my honours supervisor, the sociologist of the life sciences, Catherine Walby, pictured in the bottom right here. She's now the director of the Research School for Social Sciences at ANU. And this is some 15 years ago that I came bristling to her with ideas about scientific controversies and public engagement after spending a year abroad in Denmark in their fantastic sociology department at Copenhagen University. Nordic social sciences were deeply engaged with public policy and society in ways that were truly eye-opening for me, steering public engagement exercises around biotechnology, industry policy, and technology development. I was fascinated by the standing and respect offered to them. And buoyed by this, I buried myself in study. And this was back when I could still sink 10 pints and play soccer and write coherent paragraphs the next day. In particular, I immersed myself in debates from the 1970s and 80s in philosophy of science about positivism, whose use had become in these debates, according to Ted Benson, a term of abuse. Dr. Walby looked at me with some suspicion as I described my enthusiasm for the nuances of falsification. A little out of date, she gently suggested, and put me to work reading Pandora's Hope, Bruno Latour's forensic and fantastically gripping ride through science and technology studies debates of the 1980s and 90s. Latour's writing cut through various US-based science communication debates that I was engaged with about nuclear waste disposal, which was my empirical case study at the time. And he threw out distinctions that I'd become accustomed to about facts governing policy, about technology choices, and ultimately helped me see the ways assemblages spanning health, security, and architecture governed the waste sites I was looking at. Who was enrolling who into what, I began asking myself. Only a couple of years before Latour had published his infamous essay, Had Critique Run Out of Steam?, where he asked, was I wrong to participate in the invention of the field known as science studies? I was writing and I had suddenly encountered this tour de force. And it was easy to misread this question of whether he was wrong to participate in the invention of science studies if you didn't know his style of writing or approach to scholarship. And Latour, I want to argue in this lecture, should primarily be thought of as a humorist, not only in the sense of making us laugh, which he does for me anyway, but in distinction to what Isabel Stengers has theorised as a project of becoming and of irony in her tome, The Invention of Modern Science. And this means that Latour needs to be understood not as a capital P philosopher, or even less so as a capital S social theorist, seeking to create transcendent distinctions, but someone engaged in highly situated and historically particular debates. Without situating his work in these debates, it's easy to dismiss him as a relativist, or worse, as a bad theorist who flattens the world into a kind of sludge of actants. Another horror. Point number 2, origins and influences. Henning-Schmidtgen's intellectual biology covers Latour's origins and influences well, and the following is drawn from his 2015 English translation. Hailing from the well-known winemaking family, Latour began to study philosophy in 1966 at Dijon University. In the 1910s, Lucien Febvre taught at the same university and contributed decisively to establishing the Annales School of Historical Thinking. He studied the same disciplines as Latour, in particular linguistics and ethnology, and these would be of particular interest to Latour's writings on the sociology and history of the sciences. The University of Dijon was one of the founders of historical epistemology, the most famous form of Francophone history and philosophy of science, where Gaston Bachelard worked for 10 years. Another young philosopher was teaching in Dijon at this time and had considerable influence on Latour and maintained an even greater distance to Bachelard, André Mallet. The young student was seriously impressed, Latour, by this former Catholic priest who had a consuming interest in Rudolf Bultmann and in Heidegger. As Latour recalls, he spent 4 whole years with Mallet and during this time studied Bultmann's work intensively. And one encounters the traces of these studies in his oeuvre time and time again. In 1975, Latour completed his studies with a PhD thesis entitled Exegesis and Ontology, with reference to the resurrection, which can be read as a reference to Bultmann's work. 4 years later in laboratory life, he cites the form criticism co-developed by Bultmann when it is the question of the existential interpretation of scientific reports and accounts. And in 1984, in the first pages of his book on Pasteur, he invokes the sections of Spinoza's Tractatus Theologica Politicus that deal with the readings of the scriptures to make the case for a new kind of exegesis of scientific texts. Latour has been emphatic. His study of Bultmann directed his attention to the reading and writing aspects of scientific practice. And it was his ethnology of the Salk Institute that Latour arrived with a flourish, written with Steve Woolgar. And here we arrive at the first set of debates that Latour has engaged with. And these debates concern how we should account for the social dimensions of science. The fact that a tiny select group of men primarily comprised scientific societies, that visions for the future and for the ordering of the social present governed what theories were accepted in scientific debates. How do we think about their instruments? The fact that science and technology are so deeply enmeshed, what role should we attribute to them in scientific discovery? One cannot think of the genome without the laboratory, the reagents, the staff, the test tubes, all the stuff of experimentation. Graham Harman distinguishes 3 broad phases to Latour's work. His concern with the durability and power of non-human actants in this phase, this first phase, and his engagement with debates about science and scientists, which is then followed by a shift to the problem of political ecology and the creation of a common world, which is then followed by a third and successive phase built around 2 overlapping streams of work, which extend the first 2, his inquiry into modes of existence and his work on Gaia. and what he calls the third attractor. So this grouping of early, middle, and recent Latour is how I'm going to break up this lecture. But before I do that, I've teased you with this table from the Lancaster Science Studies Centre with their fantastic resource on actor network theory. And I want to get you to guess when this resource on actor network theory was produced. It's an extensive set of empirical studies and conceptual resources. And I'm just going to let you take a stab. Someone can throw it into a chat or just make a guess. When did they stop editing this resource? So this will give you a sense of when these debates in actor network theory were most live. So this is an online resource. So anyone want to take a guess?
Can you say the question again, Declan? What are we guessing?
So Lancaster University in England is one of the centres for thinking and applying the insights of actor network theory. And they have an online resource which has this grouping of what actor network theory has contributed to: substantive studies, theoretical works, and related issues. So I just wanted you to take a stab. When was the heyday of actor network theory? So when were they still editing this set of resources?
In the 1980s?
Yeah, it's a little bit later than that. So a lot of the papers are from the 1980s, and then they stopped editing this in actually the year 2000. So that's a bit of a sidebar, but it just helps you situate when some of the key debates that I'm talking about were actually happening. So I can share that link with anyone who's interested. So that's sort of where actor network theory arrives at in 99, 2000, when there's a lot of public circumspection about what it's achieved. And that's really the culmination of studies like Science in Action and the pasteurization of friends. Now, I would argue that actor network theory actually cuts through all of Latour's phases. And leading Lancaster Science and Technology Studies scholar and contemporary of Latour's, John Law, has argued that actor network theory can be understood as itself a different set of theories performed in different locations at different times. So in a 2006 paper, he queries, is there such a thing as actor network theory at all? The answer, yes. We can certainly make a story that tells a kind of unity, and particularly with tables like the one I've just shown you. But the answer is also no, for it is just as easy to tell a kind of tale of diaspora, of interaction with other theories of confusion, or if you prefer, complexity, overlap, and partial connection. It is much more interesting to trace betrayals in the practice of translation, rather than insisting that there is a general set of actor network principles. And this is his key point. Actor network theory has passed from one place to another, from one network to another as it has progressed. So for the purposes of this lecture, for this story, let's tell a comforting tale of unity, perhaps, that there is indeed a coherent set of ideas behind actor network theory. Sociologist of science Mike Lynch has a particularly succinct and well-formulated tale. In a 1995 review essay, he argues, simply considered, actor network theory licenses vaguely Machiavellian stories of how innovative persons and agencies manage to establish global networks for their fact-making and technology-producing enterprises. It is not a typical micro-political theory, however. Indeed, it should carry a warning label when sold in English-speaking customers, sold to English-speaking customers in the social sciences. This is because the actors in the theory are not social actors in the usual sense. They are certainly not rational actors. Instead, they are modelled along the lines of semiotic actants, in the story grammar model developed by A.J. Grimet. An actant, Lynch writes, is something like the subject position in a sentence. All manner of substantives can be plugged into the syntactic slot. Mathematical entities, the data indicate, for example. Inanimate objects, carbon combined with oxygen to form atmospheric CO2. Who is acting here? Collective agencies could also work into this slot. For example, the National Science Foundation withdrew support for the project. Psychic agencies even, his memory failed him. Fictional characters, authorless texts, transcendent deities, autonomous ideas, and so forth. But what I would draw your attention to in this wonderful litany from Lynch is that non-humans or actants are not animals, nor technologies, but they're ways of thinking about action, and particularly ways of decentering human agency. And this is the core objective of Latour's account of Louis Pasteur. It is a long rebuttal to so-called Whiggish histories of individual genius that place Pasteur himself at the centre of history and the main force behind progress in science. Furthermore, Lynch writes, in actor network theory, networks are not composed only of strong and weak ties between persons, such as are described in the field of sociometry, nor are they limited to the citational ties between texts and authors described in fields like bibliometrics. Instead, actor networks are associations between human and non-human actants, which are held responsible for historical developments. So actors in such networks often form spontaneous and surprising alliances. And Deleuze and Guattari's term rhizome has been suggested as a better term for capturing the appropriate sense of subterranean interconnection and sudden emergence. So actor network theory then is not a theory, as Latour insisted in his 1999 essay, Recalling ANT. And in his hands, it had become something of an ontology, but again, that's not, he would dispute the use of that term, that assimilates humans and non-humans into a unitary field of action. So just as we have distinguished science from the sciences, we are going to contrast power politics inherited from Plato's cave with politics conceived as the progressive composition of the common world. And here we need to distinguish between political philosophies of the early and mid-Latour. This is what Graham Harman's intellectual biography helps us see. So through the younger Latour, we have this kind of reveling in the swashbuckling claims to be the Machiavelli of inanimate things. But in texts like Pandora's Hope and in his subsequent work, he shifts his concern to the fragile composition of a common space for all. How do we live with non-humans? Latour begins Pandora's Hope, which he dedicates to Shirley Strum and Donna Haraway, Strum's baboons and Haraway's cyborgs, with the story of an encounter. So this is in the opening pages of Pandora's Hope. Latour recounts when he and a scientist had both been invited by the Vinegren Foundation to a gathering made up of 2/3 scientists and 1/3 science students. This division, itself announced by the organisers, baffled him. How, he asks, could we be pitted against scientists? We are studying a subject matter. And that doesn't mean we are attacking it. Are biologists anti-life? Astronomists anti-stars? Immunologists anti-antibodies? His writing is peppered with these sorts of jokes. And this is one of the reasons why I think Isabel Stenger's concept of humour is so appropriate. She writes, "I would like to make possible the laughter of humour, which comprehends and appreciates without waiting for salvation. I would like to make possible a laughter that does not exist at the expense of scientists, but one that could ideally be shared with them." Now, Stengers calls humour the capacity to recognise oneself as a product of the history whose construction one is trying to follow. And she devotes much of the book, The Invention of Modern Science, to unpacking this relationship between history and science. So I would direct you to that work. Humour, she continues, can be understood in distinction from irony, which is the subject of many key STS papers by Steve Woolgar and others in the 1990s. Irony requires a reference by the author to a transcendence, to a more lucid or universal power to judge that assures him or her the difference from that being studied. This is a direct quote from Stengers and from Dan Smith's translation. Humour, she writes, is an art of immanence by contrast. The difference between science and non-science cannot be judged in the name of a transcendence in relation to which we would designate ourselves as free and where only those who remain indifferent to it are free. So how then, we might ask, do we understand significant things happening in the world? How do we understand discovery, moments of profound invention, the crumbling of scientific paradigms in the face of new evidence? If not recourse to a scientific understanding of truth, what do we have recourse to? Stengers is well attuned to these moments, having worked with Prigogine, the Nobel Prize-winning chemist and physicist. And she wishes to place science with a heavy nod to Deleuze under the sign of the event. The notion of event allows Stengers to specify the relative positions of scientists and their interpreters. And here, the decisive point is no longer to deny the differences that scientists claim for themselves, but to avoid any way of describing them, which implies that scientists have a privileged knowledge of what this difference that singularizes them signifies. So, in other words, according to Stengers, science can find truths, but not the truth. As soon as we get into discussions about the God particle or promises of finding hidden meaning in the universe, science goes off the rails and loses its power, which it only accumulates through networks of human and non-human agency that are historically situated and contingent knowledge-making practices. Science could be otherwise, she insists, as does Latour. She has, for example, Isabel Stengers articulated what a slow science would look like. Our obsession with speed, rationality and metrics, she suggests, has made science like fast food, convenient but unhealthy. As Farah de Vries puts it, Latour's texts are designed to do things. They have been engineered in order to produce an effect rather than establish a demonstration. Far from trying to prove anything, Latour is explicitly engaged in persuading the susceptible reader into embracing an irreductionist worldview through his particularly adroit deployment of rhetoric. And this is why a kind of Latour's dictionary would go so stale and just wouldn't be adequate for the task of this lecture. He is not building theory. Instead, his aim is political in the small p sense of enlarging the scope of what is up for debate. Here, much of the detail of Latour's philosophical argument is indebted to Stengers. We need to avoid the short-circuiting moves characteristic of constitutional modern thinking. Both science and politics want to cut to the chase, too quickly proclaiming facts or making decisions. What is needed, in other words, is due process for cosmopolitics. And this is his formulation in the Politics of Nature and the Parliament of Things, comes out with his own form of constitutional thinking. Now, the key problem in these texts is how to bring a collective of humans and non-humans together in a common world. And the Parliament of Things is one idea and one solution, a term that he would certainly bristle at, in bringing this together. Now, I have to admit, I didn't really understand his formulation of the Parliament of Things until we workshopped someone's thesis using it in Tübingen when I was with Latour and some other postgraduate students. We certainly workshopped a simplified version of it, where each person was given a role to speak for one part of a controversy, and in this case it was around the Mississippi River. So someone spoke for the river itself, another for local crawfishers, another for the Army Corps of Engineers, and I spoke for the local business chamber. So my takeaway from this was that the Parliament of Things is a kind of deliberative space, but one with a few qualifications. Unlike Habermas, it was explicitly designed to incorporate things. And to make things public was the title of his wonderful exhibition and accompanying tome with Peter Weibel at the Centre for Art and Media at Karlsruhe. And I think this is actually a much more interesting and engaging attempt to make things public or articulate the problems he was addressing in the Parliament of Things text, the Politics of Nature. So Latour's injunction, and this is articulated in a number of key texts around this time between about 99 and 2005. So his injunction is to follow the actors. He's sort of, on the one hand, insisting that we follow the actors, and on the other hand, trying to articulate in constitutional terms what a politics of nature would look like. So he's sort of been caught between these two impulses, and I think it's a productive tension that works through in what I'm calling the final stage, which I'll get to of his work. So I think the clearest expression of his injunction to slow down and to follow the things comes in a debate with Steve Fuller at the University in Hong Kong in 2002, which was printed and in an international journal. And the key line in that debate from Latour is where he says, his argument, Latour says, as social scientists, our duty is not to put some order in the world. We are not rabbis. We are not priests. We are not policemen. We are not managers. We have to bring into our texts a little bit of the practice of the people we study. If we succeed in doing that, we deserve our meagre salaries. If you download the plugin which obliges you to make the combinatory choice, and he's metaphorically talking about plugins here, is this on the object side or the subject side or any dialectical arrangement between the two, you will bungle the data. That's exactly what I say. Nothing more, you bungle the data. You don't hear what the guys working on the chromosomes say. You don't understand what the technologist says. You don't understand what the artist says. Why? Because you've shut up shop. The whole critique was made for that. You have shut up shop on the values of ontology and the many metaphysics that people have developed to talk and to engage with non-humans. This situating move and insistence on the immanence of science is key to understanding the shift in emphasis from the middle to the recent Latour, from disarming scientists' own claims of objectivity through thick descriptions of enrolment and translation to his call to build a common world. And this modesty that he talks about is the crux of his approach to building the common world. Not only as social scientists to be like, do we need to be more modest and more reflexive, but we need to be reflexive about the powers that we're demanding of our institutions as well. Point number 5, recent Latour. So a recent interview in The Guardian saw Latour asked about his latest art collaboration at the ZKM Centre for Art and Media in Karlsruhe in Germany, which if you ever have the opportunity to visit, I would recommend highly. It's an amazing, amazing institution. Now, Latour defines the scope of human existence, the terrain of the common world, as the critical zone, a narrow band of earth that life can support. What, the interviewer asks, is the purpose of this approach? Latour responds, it is a redefinition of our landscape. The idea of the critical zone is useful because it gets you out of nature. Nature is very big. It covers everything from the Big Bang to microbes. Conceptually, that makes it a complete mess. The critical zone is limited. It is just a few kilometres thick, above and below the surface of the Earth, but all discovered life is within it. This brings us inside in a way that nature does not. Again, here's the kind of imminence of his politics. It is very different from the way of thinking that makes people such as Elon Musk think they should go on a mission to Mars. That is escapist. But when you think in terms of the critical zone, you are locked in. You cannot escape. What does that mean for politics if we are locked in and not in the infinite cosmology opened up by Galileo? It means we cannot behave in the same way. It means we cannot just endlessly extract resources and discard our waste. In the critical zone, we must maintain what we have because it is finite, it's local, it's at risk, and it's the object of conflict. So Latour's concept of critical zones occupies this third space between discourses of globalization, where he claims there is no common planet big enough for us all, and the schmaltzy romanticism, violence, and fascism of what he terms the land of old. He wrote in the journal Critical Inquiry in 2018, as the globe and the land are no longer reachable. The first one because the planet is too small for our size, and the second because those neo-nationalists offer a space much too small for us, so we need to step aside. So the Critical Zones exhibition, which has ample streaming resources and a magnificent printed catalogue, is online. And Latour's contributions to it attempt to apply this idea to a kind of interdisciplinary observatory in key sites around the world. He spent much time studying climate change related projects in Taiwan, for example, and co-curated events at the Taipei Biennale. And I would recommend the numerous online videos. But in this final section, I want to draw out some lessons from Latour's ideas of critical zones for the humanities and social sciences. So Latour developed his concept of critical zones as what he calls a third attractor, an alternative to the land of old and discourses of globalization that I mentioned. So this concept of a third attractor could become actually a useful kind of boundary concept for ANT-inspired work in ecology, social sciences, and legal studies. And I spelled some of these out in a set of short reflections after Latour's thrilling Performance Studies International lecture down in Melbourne in 2016. So I just wanted to revisit some of those. So Latour's concept of the third attractor needs to be situated in disciplinary modes of existence. So it needs to be understood alongside his inquiry into modes of existence. So this can be understood as, the sets of institutions rather than individual bodies. So I argue that his work on soil is crucial to understanding how land could be rethought under the conditions of climate change, and that the third attractor is what I call a volumetric concept as well. So we need to think about depth, not just critical zones as a flat space. And then finally, in this last section, I want to connect the concept to some of my own work. So Latour's sensitivities are embodied in disciplinary modes, and his incarnation of what he calls a sociology of associations inherits more from scientific disciplines in the context of what Ulrich Beck has termed reflexive modernisation than may be immediately obvious from those just picking up his work just straight off the bat. So Latour carefully explained to the most frustratingly obvious question of the night that his concept of the non-human owes more to Whitehead than classical sociological questions of agency. But Latour repeatedly stressed the fact that our knowledge of the new climate regime, a term he uses interchangeably with birth, is mediated by scientific disciplines in ways that are absolutely central to Ulrich Beck's work. And in this high or late modernity, we're entirely dependent on science to fix disasters of its own making. I'm just getting some feedback there. Thanks. If you could just mute yourself if you don't have a question, that'd be great. So we're entirely dependent on science to fix disasters of its own making. Radiation monitoring after Fukushima, nanoparticles to deliver cancer medicine to workers exposed to industrial toxins, new scientific sensibilities to find dependencies between plants, soils and atmosphere that may form the basis of carbon markets and other climate mitigation strategies. These are all entirely mediated by science. Can I just get you to mute, please, Akiko? So Latour's sensitivity is based on.
Sorry, Declan. I think you should be able to mute the person.
Yeah, I don't have that capacity. I'm not sure what to do.
Nice.
Simone, are you still there? Oh, ridiculous. Okay, I'll just press on. Okay, so there's really two other points I wanted to make. So Latour turns to soil in times of crisis. So the science wars were a political crisis for science studies, albeit one that the titans in the field dealt with very deftly with some brilliant and hilarious articles. So the second chapter of Pandora's Hope follows scientists through the Boa Vista, and that remains one of the most outstanding pieces of STS in the period. Now, back in the slide of this. Akiko's number. This is just ridiculous. See, I don't have most capacities in this.
You don't have a way to. Akiko, can you hear us?
She's obviously not paying attention.
No. Hey, Akiko, can you hear us? You could maybe just remove them from the chat or from the call.
Yeah, I don't have any capacity to do that because I'm not a host.
Right. Akiko, can you hear us? Because we can hear you. Could you please turn your microphone off? Could you please mute yourself? Akiko?
Thank you. Okay. So I just want to make some points about soil. Okay. So at the height of the science wars, Latour turns to soil. And this time he's back there with the stratigraphers deciding, who are deciding the epoch of the Anthropocene. The scientific tribe he's following as the anthropologist of modernity. So for Latour, soil serves two functions. Firstly, it's a convenient site to show the commonalities in epistemology between artistic and scientific work. Scientists he's spoken to routinely imagine strange associations between different non-humans in quasi-artistic ways. On a trip to the Yarra Valley, they ask him to imagine the hillsides with only networks of fungi stretching across them, as if they're rendered only in black pencil. Is this a contradiction and dialectic as per cultural studies, or a potential site of strategic positivism? He rhetorically responded to one questioner who asked whether he should be banging the table more about climate change. Land, in Latour's irreductionist reading, is an aesthetic and cultural assemblage in a similar way to theories put forward by people like Tanya Lee. So politically, for Latour, right-wing reactionary movements across the world, Italy, Denmark, Philippines, the United States, Australia, are something new, rather than the return of something old. So these are kind of modernity's frontier with its dichotomies of modern progress versus archaic knuckle-dragging reaction. And because he sees us as caught between these two dimensions, we need the concept of Gaia, Earth, or critical zones, which are all the interrelated ideas he puts forward. So epistemologically for Latour, the third attractor means multiplying objective realities. Rather than bifurcating the lived experience from scientific objects, the 20th century solution to problems that has run out of steam with problems like climate change. So performance arts are, he would argue, well equipped to achieve this multiplication, this multiplication of realities. And we could think of performances like the Climate Guardians, for example, which is pictured on the right here. So politically, this sensitivity that he's talking about here, demanded by the trialogue he's attempting to establish, involves protection of the earth, and he urges a rejection of the modernising lines and instead building alliances between those attracted to an ecological understanding of non-humans and those accused of reaction, archaism, and retreat. Now, he's quite emphatic that when he talks about Trump supporters and the fact that people like Greta Thunberg don't live on the same planet as them, that he's seeking to imagine different ways that we can live together. And I certainly doubt that Trump supporters and soil scientists have any shared definition of what it would mean to protect the Earth. But his point is that we need to devise tests about what sorts of things we can hold onto in the maelstrom of contemporary politics. Now, I would also emphasize that Latour's concept of the third attractor is volumetric, that he's encouraging us to look down rather than staring up with what he calls res extensa. And his performance studies lecture used that terminology a lot, such as lateral sideways, the thin layer of varnish on the globe, and critical zones. But it's clear that he is actually a theorist of volumes despite this kind of terminology. And he's interested in the smooth spaces of disciplinary interiors, as per the story of fungi that I just told above. And his concept of soil is not just dirt, but covers the sediments of ocean floors and the networks of life that rely upon them. As a symmetrical anthropologist of modernity, he's not there to reassert the rationality of scientists, nor to be a priest, but he's argued that we have to bring into our texts a bit of the practice of the people that we study. And finally, I was struck by the extent to which Latour's Earth marginalises law. So we might wonder what scope there is for a kind of citizenship of Gaia in building this common world. Is a version of what theorists of citizenship call jus soli, the birthright citizenship through territory, possible without simply falling back onto a kind of liberal cosmopolitanism that led us into the current impasse, perhaps? So some of my work in socio-legal studies has sought to address this question around ownership and control over organisations. And I think this really gels with all of the research in the Community Economies Research Network more broadly, how to bridge these questions. So, in this sort of last phase of Latour's work, I think he really is caught between an insistence that he's not creating a kind of alternative science or an ecological science and a constitution around it on the one hand, and his impulse to be the kind of trickster and this deft rhetorician. And I think he would be very circumspect with the proposition that he has become a kind of constitutionalist. But then I think that's really a common thread through both his work and Haraway's. And there are some really key lines in Haraway's Situated Knowledge's essay that shows that she actually doesn't want to articulate in some grounded sense a feminist philosophy of science. But I think both of them are incredibly powerful theorists in helping us to understand what it would take to build a community around problems of care, of science and society, and to do it with humour. So thank you very much. So I think we've got a bit of time for discussion and questions. So I'd welcome anything of clarification or anything more detailed. and to hear about what you're working on. Please, Anissa.
Yeah, thanks so much, Declan. I mean, you managed to cover a person who's got incredibly complex work over a long period of time and to kind of distill it down. So well done for doing that. That was really great. And just to see the different phases of his thinking and the kinds of ideas that he's worked with and inspired. I kind of dipped in and out a little bit, I guess, of his work over through my PhD, and a lot coming from this book as well, which I really liked a lot. We had a reading group on it, and so I'm just sort of coming back to that. But I'm actually curious to hear a bit more about how, the work that you're doing. I know you've got lots of different things going on, but now you're working with electric vehicles and the infrastructure for that. If you found some of these ideas helpful in a sort of practical sense, like in terms of not just writing about them as an academic, but also being involved in policy worlds in a way, in that parliament of things, and what utilities you found in, is there openness to working in these kinds of ways if you can bring visibility to the way that things enroll us into different actions and behaviors. I know Gay Hawkins working a lot with these ideas around plastic, for example, and trying to bring that into a sort of policy and research conversation. So it'd be great to hear a bit more about that.
Thanks, Anissa. It's a very generous question. And yeah, look, I think Mike Michael's exegesis is fantastic. And yeah, he's just a terrific writer, and his work on public engagement from quite a few years ago was very influential in my thinking around what sociology can contribute in this kind of slowing down and this kind of questioning, and how to be an integrated kind of useful idiot in the sciences. And I mean, he's written a very convincing essay on the idiot, actually, Mike Michaels, that I often think about. And I mean, one practical example of, this was 2 nights ago when I was writing this essay. I saw that the federal government had made this new announcement of $1 billion for the energy transition in South Australia. Much of which was directed at the gas industry. So they had some cursory remarks around carbon capture and storage, but being having spent the day rereading Latour's texts, I decided to pick a fight with some rationalist energy policy folks on Twitter about their support for carbon capture and storage. Because I think that's a kind of ideal terrain where, particularly in the US, there is this sense of, CCS is an expression of science. Well, no, it's not. It's like when you actually look at the networks of actors behind it, and when you take a kind of Latourian perspective on how the geologists are working, it's very hard, I have argued and would continue to argue, to arrive at the conclusion that CCS has facts that can travel and that it can scale up. I mean, when you understand the kind of nuance of the geological formations that they're working with, you see that every site is different, which is a kind of A&T sensibility. It kind of sensitizes you to how much difference there is in the world, and all of the work that it takes to replicate science. It's an enormous job. So I mean, this is why the kind of sociology of scientific knowledge work that insisted that science is a social construct. This is why Latour was trying to kind of build on that and say, we need to think about how these scientific facts travel through these techno-scientific networks, rather than just thinking that it's some social process as if it's kind of buddies around a table. So this is I think what's really been most helpful for me. And I mean, of course, with the electric vehicle work, Aramis is just a fantastic text that kind of moves between content and context of this case study so beautifully and just humorously. But yeah, I mean, I just think he's a funny writer and a very clever humorist, and I think that's often lost in to his critics.
Well, and I think fantastic use of images and metaphors, you know, which are the things that grasp us. And what you're talking about now reminds me of that concept of black boxing. And what you're talking about is unpacking the black boxes in those policy spaces. So carbon capture and storage being one such black box, where all of a sudden it just becomes this term where everyone's talking about it, but we're not actually teasing it apart to see how is it actually operating in specific.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's really helpful. I feel like that's a bit like the work that I'm trying to do a little bit of, and in partnership with the UN spaces and the grassroots networks that are in there, saying, you know, talking about agroecology or transformative food systems. And there's a tendency for, I think, because it takes a lot of energy to unpack things all the time, there's a tendency to just sort of use these phrases and just throw them out there, which is what's happened to something like sustainability, for example. It's just it's like a shorthand, convenient way of just saying, oh, we're doing this thing. But then, of course, there's all these meanings and ideas attached to that concept that we need to keep asking ourselves, what do we mean when we're saying that in this context? What do you mean? What do you mean? You know, what am I actually thinking? Which takes more time, but ultimately, I think we don't take the time to do that. It's like, you know, a train just running without a conductor, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks.
Thanks, Anita. Anyone else want to jump in there?
Hi, Declan.
Hi, Stephen.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. Great to get your views on Latour. I wonder if I could ask about why do people hate Latour so much? I mean, you know, I'm a Latourian myself, and I can't see what there's not to like. You know,
yeah,
a guy who's taken on the most pressing problem of our times. You know, the new climate regime, taken that head on, who operates with ontological tact and diplomacy across the multiple realities you spoke of. The principle of irreduction is just brilliant. He's renovated social theory to the point where we now have something called planetary social theory. So yeah, what do you think about some of the critics?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I was given the task for this lecture to try and cover off with some of these critics, and I reread some of the critical pieces from Olga Amsterdamska from the early 90s, from one of the more recent critical pieces from Eva Girard, and I feel like there's a kind of Hegelian longing for a more grounded sense of historical force that comes out in the criticisms of his work. I think just like with Calonne, it's kind of bitter Hegelians that dislike him the most strongly, and I think part of that is that he takes on, you know, Marxist and what he calls kind of high modernist forms of criticism most directly in his earlier work, but in a very playful way. And I think if you are a capital S, very serious scholar, then I could see why that would be offensive. But Yeah, I mean, I guess that's why I just keep going back to his humour. That yeah, it is so kind of tricksterish in its mentality and its strategy that I think it's just such a wonderful kind of approach to academic debates. That, you know, if we can't kind of share a laugh, then what are we doing, really? Yeah, I mean, why is he hated? I mean, I did read a stat a while ago that he has been cited more times than Marx. And that certainly wouldn't surprise me. So I do wonder if there's a sense of just go for the big guy, like go for the guy who's just got the profile. And that's sort of a way to build your own reputation. And yeah, I don't know, maybe. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree, and I really like your picking up on the use of humour and the performative in his work and in Stenger's, and the Bitter Hegelians, as somebody said in the chat, a great band name, and Aniso said that. So, but yeah, the Hegelians are, or the old school Marxists are. Really find it hard to let go of society being exclusively human.
Yeah.
The politics was all about human conflicts, and the dialectic will be resolved only by humans. So the challenge that Latour's put up with the Parliament of Things is a little too much for them.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and that also that like theories of class are undermined by any sense that workers would not have the primary scope for being the major historical agents, right? Yeah, but I mean, I think actually active network theory tremendously enriches cultural studies key problematics as to why revolution is so bloody hard, right? And I mean, that's sort of why I think Anissa's reference to Gay Hawkins' work is well made. That, you know, we're kind of enmeshed in all of these, in the stuff of consumption in all of these really profound ways. And yeah, I mean, I think there have been some fairly productive attempts to bridge the active network theory sort of post-Marxist divide, but yeah, it's there's certainly much more conflict there than correspondence or reinforcement from my reading. Yeah. But yeah, great question though. Why is he hated?
I might just jump in there.
Yeah, please.
Maybe a bit related as to why he's hated, but not really. But yeah, I sort of read Down to Earth, which I did enjoy most of it, but I was a bit disappointed at the end, where I think, you know, he's built up all this, you know, this story about what we've got to do and stuff, but then it sort of concludes with, you know, what are the next step? And it was all about, you know, we've got to get together and trace connections and build and follow actants and all this sort of stuff. And it just seemed to be lacking any urgency. Like, sure, doing that may keep academics employed for decades and decades, tracing associations and stuff, but there doesn't seem to be any impetus for much action in what I could, like decisive action, as opposed to just tracing connections in his work.
Yeah, no, that's a good provocation. And I may even take the liberty of asking Stephen if he wants to speak about any of his work in Northwest WA around activism, and whether you've found Down to Earth helpful with any of that work at all.
Oh yeah, sure. So I've taken Latour's modes of existence into an ethnographic space, and sort of tested it on the road, so to speak, or actually on a walking trail in Northwest Australia with Aboriginal activists and Greenie activists working together against mining companies. So it's very much in the nexus of Indigenous knowledges versus fossil fuel extraction colonialism, and certainly the down-to-earth thesis works there because of Indigenous territorialism. In a way, it's a fight against the artificial nationalism that is constituted by nation states. There's no ecological logic to a nation state, but there's an ecological logic to Indigenous regions, seaside cultures or riverine cultures, or and drawing out the Indigenous knowledges there is a significant part of the battle against the moderns, as Latour calls them, the moderns which have this industrial extractivist complex still working away. So that's how it's worked for me.
Terrific.
Yeah, what Stephen, you were just saying reminds me of one of the talks that I was listening to yesterday in the Future Earth Climate Adaptation Summit. And I'm sorry, I've forgotten the person who was speaking in that panel, but they were talking about a region in Australia that has coal mining happening. And the person was saying, what they, in reference to kind of place-based thinking about how to deal with climate adaptation, that in this area where this coal mining was going on, the coal miners and the environmentalists actually had more in common than anybody else sort of involved in that debate, even though they may have had different concerns. So rather than thinking about them on opposite sides of the issue, that to actually bring that knowledge into this sort of mix of thinking about place-based change, thinking about not that old dualism between jobs and environment, but looking at how those things actually need to work together and what people have in common, which was this deep attachment to and love for place and for where they lived. And they knew so much about the landscape. And, if you want to understand how to transition away from coal, then probably some of the best people to talk to are people who work in coal and know that industry intimately. So I think that idea of tracing associations that Justin brought up is in a way actually activist work. It's not that we're just tracing associations for the sake of it. It's that we're doing that work as a way to make visible points of connection and links that we may not have seen before that can open up new possibilities. Just some reflections.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah, I was actually reading an article the other day. It was actually comparing the historicism in relation to science of Gramsci with Latour. So perhaps there's not that much distance between some forms of Marxism, at least, and active network theory, which maybe they could reconcile themselves at some stage.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm sure there's scope for some sort of reconciliation. Yeah, I mean, I guess on the coal mining example, I mean, the questions around what you mean by place and the kinds of agencies and actors that you would tie to a place, I think is a really good way to use a kind of active network theory approach, like where is the boundaries of place that are being actually threatened by the moderns, like it's, of course, we've got climate change, but more directly, all these exploration licenses just covering huge amounts of the country, and the prospect of, all these massive pieces of mining capital coming in and literally disemboweling places. Yeah, it's like all sorts of agencies that need to be considered on their own terms, and I think that's part of what makes active network theory quite a useful piece of the armory. I mean, of course, when you're talking about modern industrial capitalism, then you need to understand those dynamics too. But once you get to a site and yeah, you're dealing with different knowledges. Absolutely. Yeah. Anyone else? Anyone else have any concerns or questions? Might be able to wrap it up then.
I suppose I would ask one. I have one more question if nobody else does.
Yeah, sure, Lisa.
Yeah, just I mean we're here, so in terms of his work on matters of concern, and then thinking about Maria Puig de la Bellacasa's work on matters of care, and where she sort of done a constructive critique, I guess, and a generous engagement with his work, but sort of tried to push it a little bit more in terms of care, because as useful and as rich as I think his work is, I think there's some of those elements in terms of what motivates us to act, which is, you know, deeply emotional, visceral, our attachments, like attachments to place or whatever it is, or attachments to ways of doing things in a way. There's habits of thinking and feeling and doing that I think are often not acknowledged in politics enough. We still seem to be quite stuck on the abstract intellectual deliberative mode, but deliberation is much deeper than that, isn't it? It speaks to so much more than just what we think about things and the facts, and then that was his critique, wasn't it, of sort of this idea of matters of fact, was saying, no, actually there are concerns here, but then Bellacasa tried to take that a bit further. I'm just wondering if you or anyone else have reflections on that, and how you're seeing that being that productive engagement being used a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess like it's a bit of a hole in Latour's ethnographic experience, thinking about settings of care beyond the laboratory. I don't think he thinks about care between humans, for example, in too much detail. I wouldn't go to him for those, for that work. Like how do we build kind of coalitions between human actors? I'm just not sure he's the best person to go to with that. Problematic, but yeah, I mean, I guess when you're dealing with seemingly incommensurable worldviews, that's where the Inquiries into Mode of Existence project, as Stephen mentioned, is so useful. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, where does care fit in the Latourian schema? Yeah, I mean, I think his How to Talk About the Body essay is just a beautiful piece of writing, and he's sort of thinking about science as an embodied activity, thinking about what it means to be sensitized to the world, what it means to care for non-humans broadly. But yeah, in terms of this, the wider kind of work that I think particularly the Community Economies Research Network has been doing. Yeah, I don't know. I think yeah, plenty of ways to kind of skin that cat, I guess. It's a bit of a squid answer.
No, that's fair enough. I mean, you know, you can't expect one person to do everything.
No, that's right. Yeah.
You know, but I do like the way Bellacasa has taken up his work and tried to extend it in some in that direction. So,
absolutely, yeah. I think it's a very useful, and productive, set of resources in that book. Yeah, it's fantastic.
For sure. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Well, thanks everyone for the questions and for the discussion, the provocations, and please email me with any final thoughts if anything comes to mind after we hang up. Thanks so much for your time and your attention.
Yeah, thank you for your time in putting this together. It was great.
Yeah, cheers. No, it was a real pleasure to go back into the books and various writing.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a good afternoon. Bye.